March 7th, 1945. Afternoon. Somewhere above the ancient German town of Remagen, a tiny single-engine airplane is puttering along at 75 miles per hour through cold winter air. It weighs less than 1,000 pounds, fully loaded. Its engine produces 65 horsepower. It is built from welded steel tubing, spruce spars, and fabric stretched over a wooden frame. It carries no armor. It carries no bombs. It has no guns. It cost the United States Army $2,600. And the men flying it are about to play a part in one of the most consequential decisions of the entire war in Europe. From the cockpit of his small observation plane, the pilot peers down through enlarged plexiglass windows at the Rhine River valley below, and through a gap in the haze, he sees something almost impossible. A bridge, still standing. Not just any bridge, the Ludendorff Railroad Bridge at Remagen, one of the last intact crossings over the Rhine left in all of Germany, undestroyed, waiting. The radio goes up. That report is one thread in a chain of events already moving at speed. Scouts from the 89th Reconnaissance Squadron, on a hilltop north of Remagen, have just confirmed the same sight through their own binoculars. Second Lieutenant Karl Timmermann and Lieutenant John Grimble, watching from the heights above the town, radio the news to their task force commander, Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman, who pushes it straight up to Brigadier General William Hoge. Hoge drives to the scene himself. He surveys what is in front of him. He weighs it against his original orders, directing his forces elsewhere. And he makes a decision that will define the final weeks of the war in the West. He tells his men to take that bridge. That afternoon, soldiers of Company A, 27th Armored Infantry Battalion, run across the Ludendorff Bridge under fire. German engineers detonate their charges as the Americans sprint across the open span. The bridge shakes and buckles, but does not fall. The men keep running. And Sergeant Alexander Drabik, a butcher from Holland, Ohio, becomes the first Allied soldier to reach the eastern bank of the Rhine, arriving there at a dead sprint without a single wound. For the first time since Napoleon's Grande Armée marched east across the Rhine during the Ulm campaign of 1805, hostile forces stood on the German side of that river. And the threads running back to the beginning of all of this include a $2,600 fabric airplane circling quietly overhead. I want to tell you about the Piper L-4 Grasshopper. Because when you truly understand what this machine was, and then truly understand what it accomplished over the skies of Europe, the gap between those two things is almost impossible to close in your mind. It is one of the most striking contradictions in the history of modern warfare, and it is a completely true story. The L-4 Grasshopper was not designed as a military aircraft, not even close. It grew from a civilian touring plane called the Piper J3 Cub, developed in the 1930s as one of the most affordable light aircraft ever built. In 1929, as economic crisis was tightening its grip on America, engineer Clarence Taylor imagined a small, economical aircraft that almost anyone with a modest income could fly for pleasure. His prototype first flew in September of 1930. Businessman William Piper bought the company the following December, refined the design, and eventually renamed the product the Piper J3 Cub. By 1938, with a unit price of just over $1,000, it had sold hundreds of copies and become a genuine American success story. The Piper Cub was the kind of plane a weekend hobbyist owned, a way to spend a Sunday afternoon above the countryside with no particular destination in mind. The aircraft that went to war started life as a weekend toy. In June of 1941, the United States Army went looking for a light aircraft that could serve as a liaison and observation platform. The J3 Cub fit the requirements almost perfectly. It was slow enough to observe the ground below with real precision, light enough to operate from improvised fields. It could carry two people, a pilot and an observer, with a radio and maps, and it was simple enough to maintain almost anywhere. The Army designated the military version first as the O-59, the O standing for observer. In April of 1942, a broader redesignation of Army light aviation changed it to L-4, the L standing for liaison. The Grasshopper nickname reportedly came from the 1941 Third Army maneuvers in Texas. Major General Innis Swift was watching the small planes bouncing across rough terrain near Fort Bliss and remarked that they looked like grasshoppers jumping through a meadow. The name stuck. Army field artillery pilots flew their J-3 Cubs in those same exercises. and umpires eventually had to ground them mid-exercise because their aerial observation was giving one side such a decisive advantage that the whole contest was becoming unbalanced. That moment quietly but firmly sold the United States Army on the idea of organic light aviation attached permanently to its artillery units. It was a lesson that would matter enormously over the next 4 years. Let me give you the actual specifications of this aircraft, because the numbers matter for what comes later. Wingspan, 35 feet and 3 inches. Length, 22 feet and 5 inches. Empty weight, between 640 and 765 pounds, depending on the variant. Engine, a Continental O-1703, producing 65 horsepower. Cruise speed, 75 miles per hour. Service ceiling, around 11,000 feet. Range, 190 to 260 miles. Takeoff distance over a 50-foot obstacle, 730 feet. Fuel capacity, 12 gallons. The entire aircraft weighed less fully loaded than a modern motorcycle pulling a small trailer. It seated 2 in tandem, pilot in front, observer behind. The rear seat had a fold-out table for maps and a radio. Enlarged plexiglass windows on both sides and above the cockpit gave both occupants exceptional downward visibility. That was the entire point. Cost, $2,600 per aircraft. A late-war P-51 Mustang fighter cost approximately $50,000. A Sherman tank cost roughly $45,000, depending on the variant and year. The L-4 was a fraction of either. At the peak of production in 1940, it was taking Piper's Lockhaven, Pennsylvania, factory roughly 20 minutes to complete one airframe. By the end of the war, approximately 20,000 aircraft of the J-3 and L-4 family had been built. Now here is the thing that every one of those numbers obscures, and the thing I want you to hold in your mind for the rest of this story. This small, slow, fragile, unarmed machine that looked like it had no business anywhere near a battlefield turned out to be one of the most effective combat multipliers the United States Army deployed in the entire European theater. Not in spite of its limitations, but, in a very real sense, because of them. To understand how, you need to understand a problem that artillery had wrestled with since the first cannon was pointed at an enemy. Artillery was the dominant killer of the Second World War. More soldiers on all sides were killed by artillery and mortar fire than by any other weapon. More than rifles, more than tanks, more than aircraft. Studies of casualties on the Western Front placed artillery and mortars as the cause of more than 50% of all combat deaths, with some analyses going considerably higher in specific campaigns. This was true across every theatre, for every nation involved. And artillery had a problem that no amount of engineering had fully solved. When your guns are positioned several kilometers behind the front line, your gunners cannot see their targets. They fire by calculation, by map coordinates, by compass bearing and measured distance. They correct their aim based on reports from forward observers on the ground, but those observers can only see what is directly in front of them. Hills and forests and buildings and the curve of the earth all limit what any man standing at ground level can observe. He can hear a shell burst, but may not be able to see exactly where it fell. He cannot see the gun that fired at him if it is on the reverse slope of a hill 2 kilometers away. And the further forward he moves to get a better view, the more likely he is to be killed before he can report anything useful. What you needed to make artillery into the precision instrument military planners had always believed it could become was height. A position above the battlefield from which you could see exactly where each shell landed, watch the enemy moving in real time, locate gun positions and vehicle columns and tanks hidden in tree lines, and radio precise corrections while the gun crews were still loading the next round. That is exactly what the L-4 Grasshopper provided. A pilot and an observer could climb to a few hundred feet and look out over an enormous breadth of ground. They could watch a shell burst and call a correction before the crew had finished reloading. They could see a column of vehicles on a road 5 kilometers back and report its direction and composition. They could spot the momentary flash of an enemy gun through smoke. They could see troops moving through a forest that was completely opaque at ground level. And because they were watching continuously, the artillery below them was transformed from a blunt instrument hitting approximate locations into a directed weapon guided in real time by a pair of eyes that could see everything. The effect on German forces was felt from the opening weeks of the campaign in France, and never let up. In the early months, many German soldiers would simply not fire at observation aircraft. The logic was cold and sensible. Open fire, and you reveal your position. The muzzle flash of your rifle, the smoke from your gun, and the movement of your vehicles, all of it becomes visible from the air within seconds, and within minutes, shells arrive on your position. The average German infantryman understood the calculation. Firing at the small plane above you is a way of pointing a torch at yourself in a dark room full of enemies. Holding still and hoping not to be spotted seemed like the safer gamble. But holding still had its own costs. You could not maneuver. Your own artillery had to be more cautious. Every time one of these aircraft appeared overhead, your unit essentially froze and waited. That is a significant tactical concession to something that carries no weapons of its own. German artillery officers understood the problem thoroughly. They did not dismiss the observation aircraft. They feared them, not because they were powerful directly, but because they made everything facing you powerful. When the little airplane appeared above your position, you knew that precise fire was coming. German after-action reports from the Western Front repeatedly cited American artillery accuracy as one of the most debilitating features of fighting United States forces. What those reports often did not spell out was the mechanism behind that accuracy. It came from the eyes above. It came from the small, slow, unarmed planes that German defenders could see and hear, and could never quite stop. And the German military never found a fully satisfactory answer to them. More than 2,700 Leiter 4S served with American field artillery units in the European theatre. Roughly 900 were lost to enemy action or accidents over the course of the campaign. These men flew unarmed, unarmored, fabric aircraft at low altitude over active battlefields where people were actively trying to kill them. They were shot at by rifles, machine guns, and anti-aircraft weapons of every caliber. Every mission was a risk, with no clean solution, too slow to outrun anything, too fragile to absorb a hit, too low for a parachute to save you if the engine quit, too visible to hide, and they went up every morning anyway, day after day. Let me also tell you what it actually felt like to fly one of these missions, because the physical reality matters for understanding the courage it required. Picture yourself climbing into the rear seat of an L-4 somewhere behind the front lines in France or Germany. The cockpit is narrow. The fabric of the fuselage is right beside your shoulder. You can feel the light frame flex slightly as you settle your weight. The engine in front of you produces 65 horsepower. You have a radio on the fold-out table, a map, binoculars, and a service pistol on your hip. You have no armor. You have no parachute in most cases, because the L-4 flies so low that a parachute would not open in time. You are completely exposed in every direction that matters. You take off from a muddy field. You climb to a few hundred feet, and then you fly toward the enemy. Below you, the battlefield reveals itself. Shell craters pock the earth, smoke rises from burning vehicles, and somewhere in that landscape, hidden in tree lines and sunken lanes and behind hillsides, are German troops and gun crews who know that the small airplane above them is more dangerous than anything its size has any right to be. Because within minutes of that pilot reaching for his radio, the ground where they are standing may erupt. Every man below you with a rifle can potentially reach you. At 200 feet and 75 miles per hour, you are a slow, small, predictable target. The only things working in your favor are that shooting at you reveals the shooter's position and that the geometry of intercepting something moving at 75 miles per hour is awkward for aircraft designed for speeds 5 times higher. Neither of those advantages makes you safe. 900 losses in a single theater is not a safety record. They just make the situation slightly less immediately lethal than it might otherwise be. This is the context in which L-4 pilots went to work, not as a single dramatic mission, as a job. Day after day, in rain and fog and winter cold, they flew their fabric planes over the battlefield and watched and reported and directed the fires that kept the advance moving. Each field artillery battalion was authorized 2 L-4S and 2 pilots from mid-1942 onward. Those pilots were not Army Air Forces personnel imported from a separate chain of command with their own priorities and procedures. They were field artillery officers who flew their own missions, observed their own batteries' fires, and called their own corrections in real time. The system had no coordination gap between the man in the air and the mission he was supporting. He was the mission. That design choice, deceptively simple, turned out to be one of the most effective structural decisions the United States Army made in preparing for the war in Europe. Over the hedgerows of Normandy in the summer of 1944, L-4S helped Allied artillery find German tanks hiding in the bocage. That ancient landscape of sunken lanes and high earthen banks where a tank 50 meters away could be invisible at ground level, from 200 feet in the air, the image changed completely. The disturbed earth where a tank had pushed through a hedge. The faint heat shimmer above a recently fired barrel. The too regular spacing of what looked like a tree line but was actually vehicles parked beneath it. The Grasshopper pilots learned to read these signs and they called them in. During the Battle of the Bulge, in December of 1944 and January of 45, L-4 pilots flew in brutal winter conditions that would have grounded many other aircraft. Some landed in snow-covered fields and taxied back and forth to compact the snow enough for a takeoff run. First, Lieutenant Joseph Gordon flew his Grasshopper in rapidly changing winter weather throughout the Bulge, landing on almost any flat surface that presented itself, his radio connecting him to the 65th Armored Field Artillery Battalion and their self-propelled howitzers below. He kept doing it until March of 1945, when a German fighter found him above the Rhine and knocked out his engine. He managed a crash landing and survived. By the standard of what these men were doing every single day, that counted as a good outcome. Now let me tell you about Charles Carpenter, because his story makes the full strangeness of the L-4 Grasshopper plain in a way that nothing else quite does. Carpenter was an Army officer assigned as a liaison pilot, flying an L-4 inches support of the 4th Armored Division under General Patton's 3rd Army. He was good at his job. He was also, by his own description to reporters, a man who believed that if you were going to fight a war, you needed to attack, then attack again, and then attack some more. At some point in the summer of 1944 in France, Carpenter decided that observing alone was not enough. With official approval, he modified his aircraft by attaching M1 Bazooka rocket launchers to the wing struts. He started with 2 and eventually mounted 6, 3 on each wing. He named the plane Rosie the Rocketer, a play on the wartime icon Rosie the Riveter. His fellow soldiers gave him a different name. They called him Bazooka Charlie. On September 20th, 1944, during the Battle of Arracourt in Lorraine, German armoured forces from the 111th and 113th Panzer Brigades launched a counterattack against 4th Armoured Division positions. Carpenter spotted the formation from his L-4, dove through incoming ground fire, and fired his rockets at the advancing vehicles. He returned to his field, reloaded, and flew 2 more sorties that same afternoon, firing 16 rockets across 3 missions in total. His attacks forced the German armour back, and in the process freed a trapped American support crew that had been pinned down watching the fight. Over the course of his combat career, Carpenter was officially credited with destroying 6 enemy armoured vehicles. He told a Stars and Stripes reporter that his idea of fighting a war was to attack, then attack again, and then attack some more. In early 1945, Carpenter was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease and evacuated home with a prognosis of roughly 2 years to live. He lived for 21 more. He returned to teaching history at Urbana High School in Illinois and died in March of 1966 at age 53. His aircraft, carrying United States Army Air Force's serial number 43-3426, spent the post-war decades living quietly in civilian registration in Europe, its wartime history unknown to the museums that briefly held it. The aircraft was identified in Austria in 2017, when its original dataplate serial number was matched to wartime records. The Collins Foundation acquired it and had it restored in Lapine, Oregon, with the original bullet holes carefully preserved. It now hangs at the American Heritage Museum in Stowe, Massachusetts, suspended on an attack run behind a German Panther tank. It is maintained in flying condition. The meekest-looking aircraft in the war had one of the most remarkable individual combat records in the entire conflict. And then there is the story of April 11th, 1945, near Dannenberg, Germany. This one is fully documented. I say that up front because without the documentation, you would not believe it. First Lieutenant Merritt Francies and Lieutenant William Martin of the 71st Armoured Field Artillery Battalion, 5th Armoured Division, were airborne on a reconnaissance mission in their L-4 Grasshopper. The aircraft was named Miss Me, simultaneously a question and an exclamation. This was Francis's 142nd combat mission. The 2 men spotted a German Fieseler Phi 156 Storch below them. The Storch was the German military's own observation aircraft. Both were high-wing, single-engine observation planes with fixed landing gear designed for slow flight and close observation. The German aircraft was larger and more powerful. Francies put his L-4 into a dive and overtook the German plane. Both American officers drew their M1911 45 caliber service pistols and fired. The German pilot began to maneuver. Francies came around again, closing to within an estimated 30 feet of the enemy aircraft. Both men reloaded and fired again. This time the Storch's wingtip caught the ground in a low turn, and the aircraft cartwheeled and crashed. Francies landed in a nearby field. He bandaged a wounded German crew member, took both men prisoner, and handed them over to a passing American armored unit within 15 minutes of landing. The engagement is documented as the last aerial dogfight in the European theatre of the Second World War. Two officers in a fabric observation plane, costing $2,600, had shot down an enemy aircraft with service pistols. Francies was recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross on April 24, 1945. The medal was not actually presented to him until 22 years later, on March 13, 1967, by Major General Walter Jensen. Francies married, raised a family, and lived quietly in Indiana until his death on May 5, 2004, at Chelan, Washington. For most of those years, his 142nd mission was not widely known outside the men who had been there. I want to stop and think honestly about the question that German commanders were quietly asking themselves throughout this campaign. How do you stop a thing like this? The Germans understood the problem. Artillery observation aviation was a role they had practiced themselves in the First World War. They knew the concept thoroughly, and they could not find a clean, tactical answer to what the Americans were doing with the L-4. If you fire at the spotter, you reveal your position, and shells arrive within minutes. If you do not fire, the spotter may spot you anyway, and shells arrive within minutes. Every tactical choice you made was potentially visible to the man above you. There was no cover in the most fundamental sense. German fighters could theoretically intercept the grasshoppers, and sometimes they did. But by 1944 and 45, the Luftwaffe was fighting desperately on multiple fronts, and had neither the fuel nor the strength to dedicate sustained effort to hunting slow observation aircraft, when hundreds of Allied bombers and fighters were filling the sky every clear day. Every resource diverted to chasing L-4S was a resource not available against a B-17 formation or a P-51 sweep. And when a fast fighter did find an L-4, the geometry was genuinely awkward. A pilot trained to fight at 350 to 400 miles per hour found it difficult to track something moving at 75. Match its speed and you risk your own stall. Attack at normal combat speed and you overshoot before you can aim accurately. The L-4's extreme slowness, the quality that made it look most absurd in a war of high-performance machines, created a real defensive problem for any attacker built for a different kind of fight. There was also a deeper, systemic failure on the German side. The Americans had woven their artillery observation system permanently into divisional structure. From mid-1942 onward, each field artillery battalion was authorized 2 L-4S and 2 pilots. Those pilots were not Air Forces personnel imported from outside with their own chain of command. They were field artillery officers who flew their own missions, observed their own batteries' fires, and called their own corrections. The man in the air and the weapon he was directing were part of the same organization. There was no coordination gap. There was no communication delay between the observer and the guns. The Germans used dedicated Luftwaffe crews in their own observation aircraft, creating exactly that friction between the air observer and the army artillery below. It was not a question of concepts or capabilities. It was a question of integration, scale, and cost. The Americans had solved all three problems with a $2,600 fabric airplane produced roughly every 20 minutes. When more than 20,000 aircraft of this type are built, and 2 are assigned to every artillery battalion in every division across the theatre, the coverage becomes continuous. Wherever American artillery was supporting ground operations in the European theatre, there was almost certainly an L-4 overhead, watching everything. Now let me bring you back to Remagen and to the larger story of the Rhine crossing, because you need to understand what that river meant in March of 1945. By early 1945, the Allied armies had been fighting their way east for 9 months since the Normandy landings of June 6, 1944. The liberation of France had followed through that summer. The failed airborne operation at Arnhem in September had cost Field Marshal Montgomery his best early opportunity to drive into Germany. Then December had brought the shock of the German Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, where Hitler committed his last armoured reserves in a gamble to split the Allied armies and reach the Channel port of Antwerp. The gamble failed. By late January of 45, the Bulge had been eliminated. Allied forces resumed their drive east, but standing between them and the industrial heart of Germany was the Rhine. The Rhine was not merely a geographic feature. It was the last natural barrier of real military consequence before the German interior. Wide, deep, fast-moving, with commanding heights on the eastern bank that had been fortified for months by defenders who knew the assault was coming. Hitler had ordered every bridge destroyed before it could fall into Allied hands. German engineers had wired every crossing with demolition charges. Every serious military mind on both sides expected the Rhine to be forced by assault, at a cost in American, British, and Canadian lives that everyone understood would be severe. General Eisenhower's plan called for coordinated crossings at multiple points along the river. Field Marshal Montgomery's 21st Army Group would execute the primary crossing near Wesel, backed by the largest airborne assault ever attempted in a single day and single location. General Patton's Third Army would push across further south. The planning was meticulous. Everyone anticipated a hard fight at the water's edge. What nobody planned for was the bridge at Remagen. The Ludendorff Railroad Bridge was a double-track structure built between 1916 and 1919, partly with Russian prisoner-of-war labor, to move troops and supplies to the Western Front during the First World War. It was named for General Erich Ludendorff. Just over 1,000 feet long, with a central arch rising above the river and fortified stone guard towers at each end, the bridge had survived Allied bombing raids throughout the winter. It was damaged on its western approach ramp, but structurally intact. On the morning of March 7, 1945, the German defenders were ready to demolish the bridge. A large charge had been packed into the western pier with additional explosives placed on structural members. When the moment came to detonate electrically, the circuit failed to fire. The exact reason was never established. The detonating cable appears to have been cut by enemy fire or shrapnel. Captain Karl Timmermann, the German engineer responsible for the demolition, threw the switch and nothing happened. Earlier that afternoon, around 2 in the afternoon, Timmermann had already fired a separate, deliberate demolition that cratered the western approach ramp to slow the approaching American armor. That was one event. The failed main charge was a second, distinct event that came roughly an hour and a half later. When the electrical detonator failed, a German corporal named Anton Faust ran out onto the bridge under incoming American fire to light a manual fuse for the main charge. He ignited it. The resulting explosion was partial. It damaged the southeast pier, buckled sections of the deck, and shook the structure violently. But the main spans held. The bridge stood. American soldiers on the heights above Remagen watched through binoculars. Scouts of the 89th Reconnaissance Squadron had spotted the intact bridge. Second Lieutenant Timmermann and Lieutenant Grimball confirmed it. The report went to Engerman. Engerman pushed it to Hogue. Hogue gave the order. Second Lieutenant Karl Timmermann was born in Frankfurt am Main on June 19, 1922. His father was an American soldier who had served on occupation duty in Germany after the First World War and married a German woman before bringing the family to West Point, Nebraska, in 1924. Timmermann had grown up as an American boy in Nebraska, had been drafted, commissioned, and was now standing at the approach to a German bridge in the town of his birth, ordered to take it by storm. He had been promoted to company commander only the day before when his predecessor, Captain Frederick Kreiner, was wounded at Stadt Meckenheim. On March 7, 1945, he was 22 years old. He led Company A of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion across the Ludendorff Bridge under fire. Germans detonated additional charges as the Americans ran. The bridge shook and rose and settled, damaged further but still standing. Timmermann kept moving and his men followed him across. Sergeant Alexander Drabik reached the eastern bank in the late afternoon of March 7th. He arrived without being hit. He became the first Allied soldier to cross the Rhine in a combat operation. 4 German officers were subsequently court-martialed and executed by the Nazi regime, held responsible for the bridge's loss. Adolf Hitler relieved Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt as commander in the West on March 10th, and Field Marshal Albert Kesselring formally assumed command the following day. American engineers worked without pause alongside the damaged Ludendorff, building treadway bridges, pontoon bridges, and a Bailey Bridge in parallel. Over the 10 days, the Ludendorff remained upright. 6 American divisions and more than 25,000 troops crossed into the bridgehead on the eastern bank. The Germans threw everything available at the crossing. More than 360 Luftwaffe sorties, including Messerschmitt Tu-62 jet fighters and Arado Tu-34 jet bombers, representing among the first combat uses of jet aircraft against a tactical ground target. On March 14th, Hitler ordered SS General Hans Kammler to use ballistic missiles against the bridge. SS battery units at Hellendoorn in the occupied Netherlands fired 11 V-2 rockets at the Ludendorff. The nearest impact landed roughly 270 meters from the bridge. One missile struck an American Engineer Battalion command post in Remagen, killing American soldiers. It was the only tactical use of the V-2 against a specific battlefield target in the war. Assault swimmers were sent into the river. Heavy artillery targeted the crossing continuously. None of it broke the American hold on the eastern bank. The Ludendorff Bridge collapsed at approximately 3 in the afternoon on March 17, 1945, 10 days after its capture. American engineer casualties numbered 28 killed and 63 wounded. By then, the parallel bridges were in full operation and the bridgehead was secure. The Rhine had been broken. While Remagen was being consolidated, General Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine at Oppenheim on the night of March 22, 1945, without prior artillery bombardment. 6 battalions were across by dawn on the 23rd at a cost of approximately 28 killed and wounded combined. Patton telephoned General Bradley that morning and told him to make sure the world heard about it. Montgomery's Operation Plunder and the airborne Operation Varsity followed on the night of March 23rd and the morning of the 24th. More than 16,000 paratroopers from the American 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division dropped on the eastern bank in a single lift, the largest single-day, single-location airborne operation in the history of warfare. Eisenhower described it as the most successful airborne operation carried out to date. The Rhine was breached at multiple points within days. Germany's ability to conduct coherent defense in the West was finished. Berlin fell in late April. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. Before I close, I want to put the L-4 into a broader context, because it belongs to a specific tradition in the history of warfare that keeps repeating itself, and that professional soldiers keep being surprised by, even though the pattern is consistent. The tradition is this. The weapon or system that turns out to matter most in a conflict is not always the most expensive or the most technologically impressive piece of hardware on the field. Sometimes it is the one that solves a real, specific, essential problem at scale, at low cost, with an integration that makes it work across the entire force, rather than only in exceptional circumstances. Think about the British radar chain that directed the defence of Britain in the summer of 1940. It was not the Spitfires and Hurricanes alone that held the Luftwaffe back. It was those fighters guided precisely to the right place at the right time by radar operators who could see the German formations before they arrived over England. The radar chain was unglamorous. It was a collection of steel towers and underground operations rooms and telephone wires. It did not look like a weapon at all. But it was the multiplier that made a smaller defending force tactically equal to a larger attacker. Without it, the fighters would have been scrambling blind. The L-4 Grasshopper belongs to that same tradition. Unglamorous, cheap, slow, unarmed, built from fabric and spruce and welded tubing. And it made the American field artillery in the European theatre into a systematically directed precision weapon that the German military never found an adequate answer to. The common thread in both examples is the same. The decisive system was the one that provided the most critical missing capability, at the scale needed to affect every engagement across the entire theatre. Not sometimes, not in exceptional circumstances, everywhere, every day, in every battalion. The radar gave Fighter Command eyes over all of southern England. The L-4 gave American field artillery eyes over every sector it supported. Both systems were built around the same insight. The weapon that is everywhere, that works continuously, that is so deeply integrated into the operational structure that it functions without special permission or coordination, is more valuable than the weapon that is technically superior but scarce and organizationally separate. The L-4 was everywhere, That is what the German army had no good answer to, not the aircraft itself. The continuous, unavoidable, systematically organized presence of eyes above the guns, in every sector, every day, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the river crossings of March 1945. Before the final word on the Rhine, there is one more thread worth following, because it connects 1945 to the wars that came after in a way that is easy to miss. After Germany surrendered, most of the L-4s were left behind in Europe, at $2,600 each. They were not worth shipping home. The army sold the surviving aircraft as surplus to European civilians for a fraction of their cost. Some were scrapped. The men who had flown them scattered back to the lives the war had interrupted, becoming teachers and farmers and salespeople and accountants, taking their stories with them and often keeping them to themselves, because nobody seemed particularly interested in what a slow observation plane had done while the fighters and the tanks were getting all the attention. The concept, however, did not disappear with the aircraft. American military planners absorbed a lesson from the European campaign that fundamentally altered how they thought about combined arms warfare. The idea that ground combat units could have their own organic aviation, permanently attached and immediately responsive, providing continuous eyes above the battlefield without needing to coordinate with a separate air arm, became a cornerstone of post-war doctrine. It evolved steadily over the following decade into the Army Aviation Branch, established in 1983, and into the helicopter scout and attack platforms that defined American ground combat in Vietnam and every conflict since. The connection between the L-4 and the helicopter is more direct than it might appear. During the war, Army planners seriously considered using L-4S to lift an entire infantry battalion across the Rhine, one soldier per aircraft, using every plane under Third Army's control. The idea was never executed, partly because Luftwaffe activity over the crossing area made it impractical. But the concept, placing infantry directly onto a tactical objective by air in enough numbers to hold ground, reads in the planning documents like an early draft of the helicopter air assault doctrine that American forces developed and used extensively 2 decades later in Vietnam. The technology to realize the idea fully, a rotary wing aircraft that could carry multiple soldiers without needing a runway, was still years away. The thinking was already there in 1945. I want to close by sitting with the central contradiction of this story. In March of 1945, the German military was still fielding some of the most technically advanced weapons ever built to that point in history. The Tiger tank's 88mm gun could destroy any Allied armored vehicle at ranges exceeding the Allied weapon's own effective reach. The Messerschmitt 262 was the world's first operational jet fighter, faster than any propeller-driven aircraft the Allies possessed. The V-2 ballistic missile, which the Germans fired at the Remagen Bridge and at Allied cities throughout the final months of the war, was the ancestor of every guided ballistic rocket developed in the following 80 years. These were genuine achievements of engineering, produced under worsening material conditions by a nation that had committed enormous scientific resources to maintaining a technological edge. And over every significant German position on the Western Front, at some point every day, there was a fabric-covered airplane built from spruce and welded tubing and canvas, barely longer than a family car, with a 65-horsepower engine, flying at 75 miles per hour, watching everything below it. And within minutes of the observer reaching for his radio, precisely directed artillery was falling on whatever he had seen. The thing that looked the least like a weapon was one of the most effective weapons on the battlefield, not because it was powerful in itself, because it transformed the power of everything around it. The Americans had identified one specific, essential need: eyes above the artillery, and they met that need with the most scalable, most practical, most integrated solution they could find. Not a purpose-built military aircraft requiring specialist maintenance teams and extended dedicated supply chains. A modified civilian plane, built at $2,600 each, assigned 2 to every field artillery battalion in the theater, flown by artillery officers who were already part of the same organization as the guns they were directing, produced roughly every 20 minutes until there were approximately 20,000 of them. The result was coverage that was continuous, everywhere, and almost impossible to suppress. When a German commander looked up and saw one of these slow, small, ridiculous-looking planes circling above his position, he understood what it meant. He knew what was coming. He had no good answer for it. He never found one. The men who flew the Grasshoppers did not come home as celebrities. The fighter pilots had their aces. The paratroopers had their dramatic drops into enemy territory. The L-4 pilots had done something harder to make dramatic and harder to explain to someone who had not been there. They had flown slowly in circles over places where people were trying to kill them, watching, talking on a radio, directing fire. Patient, dangerous, unglamorous work. Most of them scattered back to the lives the war had interrupted, becoming teachers and farmers and engineers and tradesmen, taking their stories with them. Most of them are gone now, but the doctrine they validated stayed. The idea that a ground combat unit could have its own organic aviation, permanently attached and immediately responsive, became foundational to how America fought every war that followed. The helicopter eventually replaced the fabric plane. The digital data link replaced the voice radio. But the principle, the observer, and the weapon integrated into the same organization and trained to work together in real time that came from the 1941 exercises in Texas, and from the men who proved it in practice every day, from Normandy to the Rhine. Second Lieutenant Karl Timmermann led Company A across the Ludendorff Bridge at 22 years old, under fire, with the structure shaking beneath him. Sergeant Alexander Drabik hit the eastern bank and kept running until he was across and safe. And somewhere above the Rhine Valley, circling slowly at a few hundred feet on 65 horsepower, a fabric airplane that cost $2,600 was doing what it had been doing every day since Normandy. Watching. Nobody put that pilot on the front page. Nobody wrote the headline about what the little observation plane had contributed to the opening of the Rhine. The headlines were about the bridge and the men who ran across it, which is right and fair. But behind those men, behind the decision that sent them running toward that bridge, behind the artillery that kept every German counterattack from pushing them back into the river, there was a system. 2 L4s per battalion, 65 horsepower, $2,600 each, 20,000 built, eyes above every gun. That is the story of the L-4 Grasshopper. And the men who flew it, day after day, mission after mission, over the fields and rivers and cities of Europe, deserve to be remembered for exactly what they did.